Shalom, dear friends. We are at the opening of the celebration of Sukkot, the holiday of Tabernacles. And I really want to send a message from Jerusalem, from the land of God, to all of our people and all of our friends around the world. What is the holiday of Sukkot all about? Well, the first time it is mentioned, of course, is in Leviticus 23, where God talks about the celebration of the harvest, the gathering of the crops in the land. I'm reading in Leviticus 23:37, the beginning of the 15th day of the 7th month. After you have gathered the crop of your land, celebrate the festival of the Lord for 7 days. What do we do for 7 days? We are to sit in Sukkot. What are Sukkot? Sukkot are booths. Sukkot are tabernacles. Sukkot are huts. And why? God tells us in Leviticus 23, verse 43, God says, because live in the booths for 7 days. And he explains, so that your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in booths when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. When did God put us in booths? And why did he put us in booths when he took us out of Egypt? We know that the journey out of Egypt till we reached the promised land, the land of Israel, was through the desert. In the desert, we have a situation of the light of God, but it's very strong. Man cannot survive pure light, pure heat. As we know at the beginning of Genesis, when God created the world on day 1 and day 2, he is separating the different things that are his presence to the world. But we cannot receive them in an exaggerated form. On day 1, he separates and differentiates between light and darkness. On day 2, the world is full of water. We can't live there. Even though water is a basic need, God separates and differentiates between the water that's on top and the water that's below, the heaven and the earth. And in the earth, on this 3rd day, he separates between the dry land and the oceans, so that we can manage to live. Because man needs those differentiations. Man needs those differentiations because we cannot survive with all the good of God. We need borders. We need balances. But when we left Egypt, we were in the desert. And God took us in his hands. And actually, just like in the Garden of Eden, where there's water flowing all the time, so too in the desert, there was full light all time. But God protected us from the light. He didn't move the light aside. He protected us. He built us booths, and he covered us with his gloriful glory of the clouds of glory, which should protect us from on top, which they themselves are water. Look how it's beautiful. When there was a big flood and God destroyed humanity in the times of Noah, at the end of that, he showed us the rainbow. What is the rainbow? The rainbow is the meeting between those two things, water and light, which create a rainbow and remind us that God will never destroy the world again, because God puts the border between water and light. But let's think a little bit more, a little further. What are these booths for? What are the Sukkot for? And I'm going to show you a little bit. Let's read a little bit of what the Bible teaches us, what a Sukkah is used for. The famous verses in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 2, we all recall where God says that at the end of days, all the nations will come to the mountain of God. But that's only the beginning of the prophecy. The end of that prophecy is in chapter 4 of Isaiah. And in chapter 4 of Isaiah, God talks about the beautiful and glorious fruit of the land. And he talks about the women of Zion. And then he will create over all the Mount of Zion. And finally, in verse 6, it will be a sukkah, a shelter and shade from the heat of the day, and refuge and hiding place from the storm and the rain. God is taking us into his responsibility. He's protecting us. He's building us a sukkah. He's building us a protection, a shade, a shadow. But a shade is usually something very, very temporary. It's not something very permanent, as we recall maybe in the end of the book of Jonah. In chapter 4 of Jonah, when Jonah was sitting out of the city and there was sun, he built himself, in chapter 4 of Jonah. Jonah goes out and sits in the place east of the city, and he makes himself a sukkah, a shelter. I'm reading in Jonah 4, verse 5. He makes him a shelter. He sits in the shade, and then God provided him a vine and made it grow over him to give him shade. But, as I said before, we all know, if you park your car in a shady place, a few hours later, the shade is gone. You can know that inside your house, you feel protected because it's shade all the time. But when you go outside, you need the protection of God, of the shade. What happens? In Sukkot, we are the happiest days. We are collecting and gathering our crops. And what is the feeling? The feeling takes us back to the Garden of Eden, where man had everything. He could eat, he had trees and he had fruit and he had whatever he wanted. But the danger was when he got that thought from the snake that gave him the feeling that he himself was God. And the snake told him, "You are God. You can just have to eat from that tree and you will be the God." And that is the danger. The danger is repeated again and again in the book of Deuteronomy. That a person will have everything and he will feel that actually he is the God. And he will forget his God. And the book of Psalms, again and again, God reminds us that a hiding in the shelter of God. Let's say Psalm 27, when God talks about hiding us in his shelter. God talks about hiding us in his shelter, in the house of the Lord in Mount Zion. I'm reading in Psalm 27, in verse 5. In the day of trouble, he will keep me safe in his dwelling, and he will hide me in the shelter of his tabernacle. The Sukkah, once again. And again in Psalm 91, again we repeat, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. If you remember that you are in the hands of God and everything you receive is a present from God, then you're safe. On the very week when we are finishing to gather all of our crop, God says, leave your house and go into the shelter. Go into the Sukkah and remind yourself that I am your protection. I am your shelter. I am the one who is protecting you. And the fruits of your crop are also present for me. Eventually, in the end of days, as Zechariah promises us, all the nations will celebrate Sukkot. At the end of days, Zechariah, in Zechariah 14, he tells us, in the end of days, all the nations will celebrate Sukkot. But what will be in those times? In Zechariah 14, he describes it so beautifully. He says it'll be a time when the water, I'm reading in Zechariah 14:8, on the day the living water will flow from Jerusalem and all the way to the Dead Sea. There will be summer and winter together. The Lord will be king over the whole earth. On that day, everybody will recognize that he is one and his name is one. So on that day also, there will be no light and no cold and no frost. It will be a unique day without daytime or nighttime. Back to the beginning where the whole world is full of light and we can live in such days. We are praying for those days. And that is why the Sukkot is the holiday which we, according to the tradition in the Bible, it is a celebration which refers to all the nations. Because it is the understanding that everything we have is from God. And here we are, beginning the first day of Sukkot, living in our Sukkah, leaving our permanent house, leaving the feeling as if that's the permanent house. But really, the permanent is when you're under the shadow of God. I want to wish you all a wonderful, happy Sukkot. Shalom shall be upon the world, from the Mount of Zion, to all the nations. Shalom from Jerusalem.